At this point, Game of Thrones needs no introduction. The groundbreaking series about the ever-changing dynamics of Westeros is currently in its 8th and final season on HBO. While primarily focusing on the politics and players that have gripped the continent for control of the Iron Throne, there's a greater threat growing in the north. A vast army of the dead with legions of White Walkers, led by their ruler the Night King, are on a continuous march to achieve their ultimate goal of shrouding Westeros in an unending night. This narrative through line that is present in every book presents the opportunity for critical analysis on any number of theoretical interpretations. More specifically, Game of Thrones, through its overarching central conflict, provides a dialectical framework for understanding French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and French psychotherapist and activist Félix Guattari's theory of the state's assemblage and the assemblage of its antithesis, the nomadic war machine. Consequently, assemblages have many typologies, but one that Deleuze and Guattari isolate is the state assemblage. The state assemblage differentiates itself from other types of assemblages, for the sake of simplicity and brevity, by the way it structures the many organs within it. State assemblages are formed in a way that relations between all of the different organs attempt to unify all of the other organs within the assemblage. The focus of the state assemblage is the formation of a type of unstoppable accumulation of systems like agricultural, social, and scientific. This state of continual consumption reacts back to the organs by bringing them back to a centralized point. The state gets its power not through top-down force, but rather through a central point of resonance in which all systems relate back and reinforce the original source of the state. As Deleuze and Guattari write in 1,000 Plateaus, that the state assemblage makes points resonate together. Very diverse points of order, geographic, ethnic, linguistic, moral, economic, and technological particularities. It operates through stratification. In other words, it forms a vertical, hierarchized aggregate that spans the horizontal lines in the dimension of depth. In retaining given elements, it necessarily cuts off their relations to other elements, which become exterior. It inhibits, slows down, or controls those relations. If the state has a circuit of its own, it is an internal circuit dependent primarily upon resonance. It is a zone of recurrence that isolates itself from the remainder of the network, even if in order to do so it must exert even stricter control over its relations with that remainder. Not only is the state concerned with the assimilation of all other systems, but also to create a hierarchical system within their own assemblage to structure those organs and to strengthen its own self-preservation. Moreover, through this articulation of the state and how it is structured, the state to Deleuze and Guattari is much less a static object but more of a process. The state does not exist as an outright institution, but rather a mode of consumption that is propped up by other institutions. Under this theory, it stands to reason that all states share one basic structure and function, but differ in the way that they express this structure and function. Andrew Robertson puts this difference into perspective. States vary in terms of the relative balance between adding and subtracting axioms. An axiom here refers to the inclusion of a particular group or social logic or set of desires as something recognized by a state. Examples of additional axioms would be the recognition of minority rights, the recognition and systemic inclusion of minority groups in formal multiculturalism, the creation of niche markets for particular groups, and the provision of inclusive services. The subtraction of axioms consists in the encoding of difference as prompts to be suppressed. For example, in the classification of differences as crimes, the institutionalization of unwanted minorities, or the restrictions of services to members of an in-group. States structure themselves in a way that they consume other subjects into themselves to further the goal of the very process. This very goal is usually a monopolization of the formation of hierarchical social relations, referred to as striation by Deleuze and Guattari, between people in the state. The state's main purpose is to define what mode of relationship that a subject can have within greater society. Andrew Robertson later provides the example of laws of dispersal in places like Britain, where the government has control of how the subjects in that government interact together. Another example is the limitation of free speech in the United States. Though free speech is guaranteed, the state has imposed its designated form of that free speech through laws that prevent people from doing things like shouting fire and using fighting words. The process of the state is formed in a way to produce a monopoly on the inner relations of the subject that lay within it. This concept is perfectly articulated in the narrative of Game of Thrones, primarily through the Night King and his legions of undead. The undead army, much like the state, is formed in an assemblage. Its organs work towards a process to regulate the inner relationship within itself. The Night King, the White Walkers, and the regular undead all have the express purpose of incorporating independent axioms within their state. The undead army, after killing or capturing someone in battle, can turn that once living soul into a foot soldier in their army. After this conversion, the undead state then sets boundaries on the relationship that each member of the army has within it. It structures itself in a hierarchical format where the Legion answers to the White Walkers, who then answer to the Night King. This process is for the express goal of monopolizing the entirety of all subjectivity on the continent of Westeros in an eternal winter, or rather, placing everyone under the hierarchical control of the undead state with no hope of escaping it. Moreover, the structure of the undead army is only kept alive through one centralized point of resonance, the Night King. The Night King is the sole point that sustains the entire undead state, with all other entities in the army serving faithfully to complete his goal. However, hope is not completely lost for the continent of Westeros, as Deleuze and Guattari provide a political strategy to confront the never-ending consumption of the undead state. To counter the assemblage of the state, Deleuze and Guattari theorize of an antithetical method known as the nomadic war machine. However, to use the term war machine may be a point of contention. As Andrew Robertson later writes, the war machine is used because Deleuze and Guattari derive their theory from Pierre Castillo's theory of the role of ritualized, often non-lethal, warfare among indigenous groups. Paul Patton has suggested the war machine would better be called a metamorphosis machine. Others have used the term difference engine, a machine of differentiation, and there are lots of overlaps with the idea of autonomous groups or movements in how the war machine is theorized. Instead of drawing comparisons to institutions like the military-industrial complex or traditional conflicts like World War II, which are assigned to the state-owned military, the war machine should be thought of as a grassroots movement that bands together to confront violent state control. The war machine is made up of people who actively resist state control in the pursuit of pure freedom. The war machine, contrary to the state, does not seek to consume autonomous subjects within its ranks. Rather, the war machine seeks to deconstruct those very ranks. The war machine structures itself to come in direct confrontation with the way the state monopolizes the subjects that position themselves in the state. The state process has striated social hierarchical relationships, and the war machine seeks to return those striated spaces into smooth spaces. The smooth space is the exact opposite of striated space. While a striated space is a space where movement is regulated in certain ways, a smooth space is an open landscape without restrictions. This structure can provide a political strategy for the deterritorialization of space that has already been taken over by the state. Though not the goal of the war machine, conflict between the war machine and the state are inevitable. Since the goal of the war machine and the state are completely antithetical to one another, the groups violently clash for the control of space. A modern example of this clash for control is on the Gaza Strip between the State of Israel and the war machine of occupied Palestine. Because Israel seeks to control or striate the Gaza Strip, it places them in direct confrontation with the citizens of Palestine. Though Palestinians do not want to violently confront the State of Israel, they are forced to resist them to preserve their freedom or smooth space for control of the space by Israel. This conflict is fundamentally over the territorialization of not only the geographic location of the Gaza Strip, but also the socio-hierarchical relationship that Palestinian populations wish to structure themselves. The State of Israel has regulated the way that Palestinians desire to form themselves by preventing the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state, or a single secular Palestinian-Israeli state. The war machine rises up as an almost necessity of populations that find their goals opposite to the state process. Consequently, the war machine is structured in a way that allows itself to potentially win out against the state. The state's offensive force, the military, is built to confront other statehoods, in this case other nation-states. The military is built to immobilize their enemy for later conquest and profit, but not complete destruction. This is where the war machine takes the upper hand over the state, existing in a position of complete confrontation, accepting nothing else besides the total obliteration of state activities. An example of this is the Vietnam War. Because the United States military sought to preserve the nation of Vietnam for later colonial exploitation, it metaphorically pulls its punches against the outclassed war machine of the Viet Cong, which allowed the Viet Cong, who accepted nothing but the removal of the United States from the region, to eventually win out in the end. The war machine's goal of complete destruction of the state space creates the opportunity to confront oppressive power structures. This is where hope potentially lies for the future of Westeros against the oncoming army of the dead, at least theoretically, in the nomadic war machine of the Dothraki army. The Dothraki are a stateless group of the deadliest warriors of Game of Thrones. They possess many similarities to the ideal nomadic war machine Deleuze and Guattari theorize in their book 1,000 Plateaus. The Dothraki are vehemently opposed to any type of state-type organization, raiding and burning any state process that appears in their smooth space in the Dothraki Sea, as well as not seeking to control those they have conquered in a state-type institution, favoring the destruction of those that they conquer. Furthermore, their governance is determined less on every subject serving the state, but a radical democracy where bands, if they feel their leader is weak or ineffective, secede from the main band and form their own organization. Through this radical confrontation process, the Dothraki, at least theoretically, hold the power of a grassroots nomadic war machine that poses a direct threat to the striated space of the Night King's army. Thus, Game of Thrones, through its overarching central conflict, provides a dialectical framework for understanding Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the state's assemblage and the assemblage of its antithesis, the nomadic war machine. The Night King and his eternal pursuit of striating the space of Westeros can be used metaphorically to describe the way that state assemblages are structured and operated, and the Dothraki can provide the solution to state control due to its structural assemblage as a nomadic war machine whose goal is the obliteration of any type of state control. However, if this political strategy is proven successful is still to be determined in the final season of Game of Thrones.